It's March 23rd, 1945. The morning air near Remagen is thick with diesel fumes and cordite. Staff Sergeant Raymond Jez of the 67th Armoured Regiment grips the commander's hatch of his M4A3E8 Sherman, watching the ridgeline through his binoculars. His loader has just finished counting their ammunition. Among the standard armour-piercing rounds sits their most precious cargo, 8 M93 HVAP shells with tungsten carbide cores. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The crew doesn't know it yet, but in less than an hour, those 8 rounds will do something American tankers had only dreamed of since D-Day. They'll punch through the frontal armour of a Tiger I at nearly 2,000 yards, a feat that German doctrine claimed was impossible for any 76mm gun. What happens next will shatter the confidence of Wehrmacht tank crews who'd spent 3 years believing their Tigers were invincible fortresses on tracks. But this moment didn't begin in the mud of the Rhineland. It started in the testing grounds of Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, where American engineers were desperately trying to solve a problem that had plagued US armour since North Africa. How do you kill a Tiger when your standard shells bounce off its hide like raindrops? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Tiger problem had haunted American planners since 1942. When the first reports reached Washington about this new German heavy tank, many dismissed them as propaganda. 88mm gun? 100mm of frontal armour? Impossible, they said. No nation could field such monsters in any meaningful numbers. Then came Kasserine Pass in February 1943, and American illusions died in the Tunisian sand. The Tiger's armour was more than just thick steel. It was a psychological weapon. German crews knew that most Allied tanks couldn't penetrate their frontal plates beyond 500 yards. They'd position themselves at long range, methodically destroying Shermans, while remaining virtually immune to return fire. One Tiger commander, Michael Whitman, destroyed 21 British vehicles in 15 minutes at Villers-Bocage, most from ranges where their shells couldn't even scratch his paint. American crews tried everything. They aimed for tracks, hoping to immobilize Tigers so artillery or air support could finish them. They attempted flanking maneuvers, racing through deadly kill zones to reach the Tiger's thinner side armour. Many died trying. The standard 75mm gun on most Shermans could barely dent a Tiger's frontal armour even at point-blank range. The newer 76mm gun, introduced in 1944, improved things slightly. With standard M62 armour-piercing shells, it could theoretically penetrate a Tiger's front at about 500 yards under perfect conditions. In reality, shells often shattered or bounced at angles. Enter the M93 HVAP round. High-velocity armour-piercing. The name barely hints at its revolutionary design. Inside an aluminum body sat a sub-caliber penetrator made from tungsten carbide, one of the hardest materials available to 1940s metallurgy. The physics were elegant. Reduce the projectile's weight while maintaining the same propellant charge, and you dramatically increase velocity. Concentrate all that kinetic energy into a smaller, denser core, and you multiply penetration power. The numbers were staggering. While a standard armour-piercing round left the barrel at 2,600 feet per second, the HVAP screamed out at 3,400 feet per second. That extra velocity translated into devastating penetrating place 213 power. Tests at Aberdeen showed the M93 could punch through 157mm of armour at 500 yards. At 1,000 yards, it still retained enough energy to penetrate 135mm. Even at 2,000 yards, under ideal conditions, it could theoretically pierce 110mm, enough to threaten a Tiger's frontal plate. But theory and battlefield reality are different animals. The tungsten core that gave HVAP its power was also its weakness. Tungsten was incredibly hard but brittle. At extreme ranges or bad angles, the core could shatter on impact rather than penetrate. Temperature affected performance. In the freezing cold of the Ardennes or the blazing heat of southern France, results varied. Crews learned through bitter experience that HVAP worked best at moderate ranges, between 800 and 1500 yards, where velocity remained high, but the core stayed intact. The scarcity made every round precious. Tungsten came primarily from China, and every ounce was fought over by competing military needs. Machine tools, aircraft engines, artillery shells, everything needed tungsten. By early 1945, production had increased, but frontline units still received only a handful of HVAP rounds per tank. Crews hoarded them like gold, saving them for when regular ammunition failed. Training emphasized shot discipline. Don't waste HVAP on targets regular rounds could handle. Save it for heavy armor. Aim for flat surfaces, where the round would strike perpendicular to the armor. The gun mantlet, the lower glacis plate where the armor was vertical, the turret face. These became the killing zones where HVAP could work its magic. German intelligence knew about HVAP by late 1944. Captured rounds were sent to weapons testing facilities. German engineers were impressed, but not initially alarmed. The rounds were clearly rare. Most captured Shermans carried fewer than 5. German doctrine still emphasized keeping Tigers at long range where even HVAP would struggle. What they didn't anticipate was how American crews would adapt their tactics around these precious shells. The Rhineland campaign of early 1945 became the proving ground. As Allied forces pushed toward the Rhine River, German armor concentrated to stop them. Tigers, Panthers, and the new King Tigers appeared in greater numbers. But something had changed. American tank crews no longer automatically retreated when Tigers appeared. They had tungsten teeth now, and they knew how to use them. March 1945 saw some of the war's most intense tank battles. The Germans, desperate to hold the Rhine line, committed their best remaining armor. The Americans, bolstered by increasing HVAP supplies and hard-won experience, met them head-on. The muddy fields between the Ruhr and the Rhine became a proving ground for American tank gunnery. The German crews fighting in March 1945 weren't the veterans of 1943. Most experienced panzer troops had died in Normandy, the Falaise Pocket, or the Eastern Front. These were young men, hastily trained, told their Tigers were invincible, thrust into battle with a few weeks of preparation. They'd learned tactics from manuals that assumed technical superiority would always triumph. They positioned their Tigers in the open, confident in their armor, using the same long-range engagement tactics that had worked for 3 years. The Americans facing them had survived Normandy, the Lorraine campaign, the Bulge. They knew every weakness of their Shermans, every advantage of German armor. But they also knew something else. They had the tools to win if they were smart about it. They'd learned to work in teams, to use combined arms, to make every tungsten round count. Which brings us back to that morning near Remagen. Staff Sergeant Jez's platoon had been advancing along the autobahn when the word came down, Tigers spotted on the ridge ahead. 3 of them, hull down in perfect defensive positions, commanding the entire valley. The standard playbook would have been to call for artillery, wait for air support, or attempt a costly flanking maneuver. But Jez had 8 HVAP rounds, and his platoon had 12 more Shermans with similar loads. The morning mist gave them concealment. The Tigers, confident in their superiority, hadn't bothered to dig in properly. Their commanders stood in their hatches, scanning for targets at extreme range, never expecting American tanks to engage from beyond 1,000 yards. The ambush position Jez's platoon took wasn't accidental. They'd studied the terrain for days, knowing the Germans would eventually position heavy armor on that ridge. They'd measured ranges, calculated angles, identified every piece of cover. When the Tigers appeared exactly where expected, the Americans were ready. 13 Shermans spread along a tree line, each crew knowing their assigned target, each gunner with HVAP rounds already loaded. At 7:43 a.m., Jez gave the order. 13 76mm guns fired almost simultaneously. The tungsten rounds crossed 1,800 yards in less than 2 seconds. The first Tiger took 3 hits. 1 bounced off the turret's curved surface, but 2 found the flatter surfaces of the gun mantlet and driver's vision port, both penetrated. Inside the Tiger, the effect was catastrophic. The tungsten core, after punching through the armor, fragmented into white-hot particles. These fragments ignited hydraulic fluid, ammunition propellant, anything flammable. The crew had perhaps 3 seconds before the ammunition cooked off. Only 2 escaped through the bottom hatch. The turret, all 12 tons of it, lifted 5 feet into the air when the ammunition exploded. The second Tiger's crew, shocked by their companions' destruction, tried to reverse down the ridge. Their movement exposed the lower, side armor. 2 HVAP rounds found this weakness. The Tiger slewed sideways, track destroyed, armor breached. Smoke poured from the engine compartment. The crew bailed out, running across open ground as machine gun fire chased them. The third Tiger's crew reacted faster. They'd identified the American position and were traversing their 88 to engage. The massive gun swung toward Jez's Sherman. At 1,800 yards, an 88mm round would slice through a Sherman like butter. Jez's gunner fired first. The HVAP round struck just below the Tiger's gun, penetrating the mantlet and destroying the elevation mechanism. The Tiger's gun drooped uselessly. A second round from another Sherman penetrated the turret ring. The Tiger, mission killed if not destroyed, sat immobilized until American infantry captured it that afternoon. The engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. 3 Tigers destroyed or disabled at ranges, German doctrine said was impossible for American tanks. But more important than the tactical victory was what it meant for the soldiers involved. The myth of Tiger invincibility had been shattered with tungsten cores and American marksmanship. Word spread quickly through the armored divisions. 3 Tigers killed at 1,800 yards. The details grew with each telling, but the core truth remained. With HVAP, American gunners could reach out and touch the enemy at ranges previously thought impossible. Tank crews who'd spent months fearing the sight of a Tiger's boxy silhouette now actively hunted them. The psychological shift was profound. German tank crews, especially the inexperienced replacements, began to lose confidence. They'd been told their armor made them invulnerable, that American tanks were inferior, that technical superiority would ensure victory. Now they discovered American shells could penetrate their strongest armor at ranges where they felt safe. They began to hesitate, to seek cover more quickly, to avoid the aggressive tactics that had served German armor so well earlier in the war. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The intelligence reports from late March 1945 make for fascinating reading. German commanders complained about the new American super ammunition that could penetrate any armor at any range. The reports were exaggerated. HVAP had very real limitations, but the fear was pars, genuine. Tank crews who had once charged confidently into battle now approached every engagement with caution. One captured German tank commander, Hauptmann Erich Müller of the 506th Heavy Tank Battalion, described the shock. "We were told the Tiger's frontal armor was impenetrable to American guns. My gunner laughed when we first saw Shermans at 2,000 meters. He stopped laughing when our wingman's turret exploded. I had never seen a Tiger destroyed frontally at that range. It was incomprehensible." The American crews using HVAP developed their own culture around the tungsten rounds. They gave them nicknames: Tiger Killers, Can Openers, Golden Bullets. Some crews painted small tungsten symbols on their turrets for each heavy tank killed with HVAP. The rounds became talismans, psychological weapons as much as physical ones. Technical analysis after the war revealed just how effective HVAP had been in those final months. Of the Tigers destroyed by American tanks between January and May 1945, nearly 40% fell to HVAP rounds, despite these rounds making up less than 5% of ammunition fired. The efficiency was remarkable. When used properly, at the right range and angle, HVAP had a first-round hit probability nearly double that of standard ammunition. But the story isn't just about technology, it's about adaptation, about American crews learning to maximize their advantages while minimizing weaknesses. They developed new tactics specifically for HVAP employment. Instead of closing to point-blank range or attempting dangerous flanking maneuvers, they could engage from covered positions at medium range. They learned to identify the flat surfaces on German tanks where HVAP worked best. They practiced ranging and angle calculation until it became instinctive. The logistics officers who managed HVAP distribution became unsung heroes. They developed priority systems, ensuring crews most likely to encounter heavy armor received the precious rounds. They tracked every shell, creating detailed reports on usage and effectiveness. By April 1945, production had increased enough that most Shermans carried at least 6 HVAP rounds, with some platoon leaders hoarding up to 12. The German response to HVAP was telling. In the war's final weeks, several Tiger units received orders to avoid direct engagement with American armor beyond 1,000 meters. Think about that. The Tiger, designed as a breakthrough tank, a steel monster meant to smash through enemy lines, was being told to avoid long-range duels with Shermans. The psychological tables had completely turned. Engineers on both sides studied the HVAP phenomenon intensively. The Germans, despite their advanced metallurgy, couldn't produce tungsten-core ammunition in meaningful quantities. They'd used their tungsten supplies for machine tools and industrial applications, never anticipating they'd need it for tank ammunition. The Americans, with access to Chinese tungsten and better resource management, could afford to put it in shells. The captured Tiger from Jez's engagement provided valuable intelligence. American engineers found the tungsten penetrators had created nearly perfect holes through the armor, with minimal spalling but maximum post-penetration effect. The fragmentation pattern inside the tank showed why HVAP was so lethal, unlike standard rounds that might penetrate but cause limited internal damage. The tungsten-core's fragmentation ensured catastrophic results. Training manuals written in April 1945 show how quickly the Army adapted to HVAP tactics. Gunners were taught to estimate range using the apparent size of enemy vehicles. They memorized penetration tables showing exactly how much armor HVAP could defeat at various ranges. They practiced trigger discipline, learning when to use precious tungsten rounds and when standard ammunition would suffice. The German tank crews who survived the war often spoke about the transformation they witnessed. Feldwebel Hans Becker, a Tiger commander who surrendered in April 1945, said, "In 1943, we were hunters. By 1945, we were the hunted." The Americans had learned not just how to kill our tanks, but how to make us afraid of them. That psychological shift was as important as any technical advantage. Veterans of the Rhineland campaign developed a grudging respect for German armor, even as they learned to destroy it. They understood the Tiger was still a formidable opponent. Its 88mm gun remained lethal at any range. Its armor, while no longer impenetrable, still required precise shot placement. The German crews, even the inexperienced ones, fought with desperation and courage. But the mystique was gone. The Tiger was just another tank to be destroyed, albeit one requiring tungsten instead of steel to kill. The production statistics tell their own story. In January 1945, American forces in Europe received 12,000 HVAP rounds. By April, that number had risen to 48,000. The tungsten that had been so scarce in 1944 was now flowing in quantities sufficient to arm every American tank crew with enough rounds to engage heavy armor confidently. Post-war analysis revealed something interesting about the psychological impact of HVAP. German tank losses to tungsten rounds were significant but not overwhelming. What mattered more was the fear they created. German crews became tentative, defensive, unwilling to exploit their armor's advantages. They spent more time seeking hull-down positions, less time maneuvering aggressively. This defensive mindset reduced their effectiveness more than the actual rounds destroyed tanks. American crews, conversely, grew increasingly aggressive as HVAP supplies increased. Engagements that would have prompted retreat in 1944 now saw Shermans standing their ground. The knowledge that they carried Tiger-killing rounds in their ready racks transformed cautious tank crews into hunters. They sought out German armor, confident in their ability to penetrate even the heaviest protection. The story of Sergeant Jez's engagement near Remagen became legendary within the 67th Armored Regiment, not for the tactical victory, though destroying 3 Tigers was certainly noteworthy, but for what it represented, the moment American tank crews stopped fearing German armor and started hunting it. Jez himself was modest about the achievement, saying simply, "We had the right ammunition at the right range. The tungsten did the work." But it wasn't just about tungsten. It was about industrial capacity, about learning from defeats, about developing counters to enemy advantages. The HVAP round represented American problem-solving at its best. Faced with enemy tanks they couldn't penetrate, they didn't try to build heavier tanks, they built better ammunition. When tungsten was scarce, they managed supplies carefully. When production increased, they distributed it efficiently. The veterans who used HVAP in combat often struggled to explain its impact to those who hadn't been there. How do you describe the relief of knowing you could fight back? The confidence that came from carrying rounds capable of killing any German tank? The psychological transformation from prey to predator? Tank gunner James Morrison perhaps said it best. Before HVAP, we threw rocks at dragons. After HVAP, we had Dragon Slayer arrows. Not many, but enough to make the dragons afraid. The technical evolution continued after the war. The lessons learned from HVAP development influenced ammunition design for decades. The principle of using dense, sub-caliber penetrators became standard in modern tank ammunition. The tungsten carbide cores of 1945 evolved into the depleted uranium penetrators of today. But the basic concept, concentrate kinetic energy into the smallest, densest possible projectile, remains unchanged. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Korean War veterans who'd fought in Europe noticed the difference immediately. In Korea, HVAP was plentiful. Every Sherman carried a full load of tungsten rounds. North Korean 34 tanks, considered formidable opponents, were destroyed at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Veterans who'd hoarded every tungsten round in Europe now fired them freely. The ammunition that had been precious as gold in 1945 was standard issue in 1950. The German perspective on HVAP evolved significantly post-war. Wehrmacht Veterans Associations published detailed analyses of American ammunition development. They acknowledged that while German tanks remained technically superior in many ways, American industrial capacity and innovation had neutralized those advantages. The ability to produce tens of thousands of tungsten rounds while Germany struggled to fuel its tanks exemplified the different approaches to warfare. One German study, published in 1952, concluded that HVAP had accelerated German armor losses in the war's final months by approximately 30%, not just through direct kills, but through the tactical changes it forced. German tanks that might have held positions were forced to withdraw. Attacks that might have succeeded were cancelled when crews learned Americans had tungsten ammunition. The psychological weapon proved as powerful as the physical one. The industrial story behind HVAP production deserves attention. American factories that had never worked with tungsten carbide learned to machine this incredibly hard material. New techniques were developed for bonding tungsten cores to aluminum bodies. Quality control systems ensured every round met specifications. Workers who'd been making car parts in 1941 were crafting tank-killing ammunition by 1945. The tungsten itself came from remarkable sources. Chinese mines, operating under Japanese threat, somehow continued production. American prospectors discovered new deposits in Colorado and California. Recycled tungsten from worn machine tools was recovered and repurposed. Every source was exploited to feed the ammunition production lines. By war's end, America was producing more tungsten carbide ammunition than the rest of the world combined. The distribution system was equally impressive. HVAP rounds were tracked from factory to battlefield. Serial numbers on each round allowed post-combat analysis of performance. Crews submitted detailed reports on every tungsten round fired, range, target, result. This data fed back to engineers, who continuously refined the design. The M93 round issued in May 1945 was measurably better than the one from January, thanks to this feedback loop. Training films from early 1945 show how seriously the Army took HVAP education. Tank crews watched detailed animations of tungsten penetrators defeating armor. They studied cutaway models showing penetration mechanics. They practiced on firing ranges with limited HVAP allocations, learning to make every round count. The investment in training multiplied the ammunition's effectiveness. The story reaches beyond just American forces. British tank crews operating Shermans also received HVAP, though in smaller quantities. Free French armoured units got their first tungsten rounds in February 1945. Even Soviet forces, through Lend-Lease, received limited HVAP supplies. The tungsten rounds became a symbol of Allied industrial cooperation and shared technology. But let's return to that morning near Remagen, because what happened after the engagement was equally significant. The 3 destroyed Tigers were examined by intelligence officers within hours. They measured penetration angles, analysed fragment patterns, documented every detail. The information was distributed to all Allied armoured units within days. Lessons learned from one engagement immediately benefited crews hundreds of miles away. The German reaction was swift and telling. Within 48 hours, new tactical instructions were issued to all Tiger units in the sector. Maintain greater distance from American positions. Assume all Shermans carry armor-defeating ammunition. Avoid frontal engagements at medium range. The mighty Tiger, which had spent 3 years dictating engagement terms, was now reacting to American capabilities. The crew of the captured Tiger provided valuable intelligence. Under interrogation, they revealed their training had never covered defending against tungsten ammunition. They'd been taught American shells would bounce off their frontal armor at anything beyond 500 meters. The gunner admitted he'd been aiming carefully at 1800 meters, confident he had time for multiple shots. The first HVAP impact had stunned him into immobility. Sergeant Jez's after-action report, declassified decades later, provides insight into the crew's mindset. We knew the Tigers were up there, and we knew they'd be confident. That confidence would make them sloppy. We had 8 tungsten rounds. I figured we'd need 3 per Tiger, maybe 4. When we killed all 3 with 5 rounds total, I knew we'd turned a corner. The tungsten gave us reach, but training and preparation won the fight. The 5 surviving HVAP rounds in Jez's tank were immediately redistributed to other crews expecting contact with heavy armor. This constant redistribution was typical. Tungsten rounds flowed to wherever Tigers or Panthers were expected. Crews heading into heavy combat might receive extra allocations, while those in quiet sectors surrendered their precious rounds to those who needed them more. By late March 1945, American armored doctrine had fully integrated HVAP capabilities. Combined arms tactics were adjusted to account for the ability to engage heavy armor at longer ranges. Artillery could focus on other targets, knowing tank crews could handle Tigers. Infantry could advance more confidently, knowing supporting Shermans carried tungsten teeth. The propaganda value wasn't ignored either. Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, published articles about tungsten ammunition and its Tiger-killing capabilities. Radio broadcasts mentioned the new ammunition, knowing German intelligence monitored them. The psychological warfare was intentional. Make German tank crews doubt their equipment's superiority, make them hesitate, make them afraid. German propaganda tried to counter this narrative. Radio broadcasts claimed HVAP was unreliable, that tungsten rounds shattered harmlessly against proper German steel. They emphasized the few occasions when HVAP failed, rather than its many successes. But frontline troops knew better. They'd seen Tigers burn after being hit by American tanks at impossible ranges. Propaganda couldn't overcome battlefield reality. The supply situation improved dramatically in April 1945. Operation Zebra, the massive logistics effort to supply the final push into Germany, prioritized HVAP distribution. Convoys of ammunition trucks, heavily guarded, carried tungsten rounds to every American armored unit. By mid-April, some battalions had more HVAP than they could use. Crews who'd treated each tungsten round like a sacred relic now had full ammunition racks. This abundance changed tactics again. Crews could afford to use HVAP against Panthers, against assault guns, against any armored target. The specialized Tiger killer had become a general-purpose armor defeater. German forces found that even their medium tanks were vulnerable at ranges they'd considered safe. The battlefield geometry that had favored German armor for years suddenly shifted toward the Americans. The final weeks of the war saw HVAP used in ways never originally intended. Crews discovered tungsten rounds were devastatingly effective against fortifications. The dense penetrators could punch through concrete bunkers, destroying machine gun positions that had stopped infantry advances. Buildings hiding anti-tank guns could be engaged through walls. The tungsten round designed to kill Tigers became a universal problem solver. One remarkable engagement from April 12th illustrates this evolution. Near Halle, a platoon of Shermans encountered a mixed force of German armor, 2 Tigers, 3 Panthers, and several assault guns, defending a critical crossroads. 3 months earlier, this would have required careful maneuvering, artillery support, maybe airstrikes. Instead, the American tanks formed a firing line and engaged at 1,500 meters. In 4 minutes, using primarily HVAP rounds, they destroyed or disabled every German vehicle. Not a single Sherman was hit. The German crew members who survived that engagement were interviewed after capture. Their shock was palpable. They'd been told American tanks were inferior, that German engineering would prevail. Instead, they'd been systematically destroyed at range by tanks they'd been taught to despise. One Panther commander said simply, "It wasn't warfare as we understood it, it was execution." The mathematical precision of HVAP employment by April 1945 was remarkable. Experienced crews could estimate range within 50 meters just by eye. They knew exactly where to aim on each German tank model for maximum effect. They understood how temperature and barrel wear affected trajectory. What had been experimental ammunition in September 1944 had become a precision instrument by April 1945. Veterans often remarked on the sound HVAP made. Unlike standard rounds, the tungsten projectiles produced a distinctive crack when fired, almost like a rifle rather than a cannon. German tankers learned to recognize this sound, knowing it meant tungsten was heading their way. Some crews would bail out immediately upon hearing that distinctive crack, preferring capture to burning alive inside their tank. The psychological warfare continued until the very end. American units would sometimes fire single HVAP rounds at extreme range, not expecting to hit anything, but knowing German crews would recognize the sound. The threat of tungsten at their doorstep kept German tanks buttoned up, reduced their awareness, made them tentative. A single round could paralyze an entire German position through fear alone. As American forces pushed deeper into Germany, they encountered the desperate last stands of Wehrmacht armor. Fanatical SS units, Hitler Youth formations, scraped together battle groups of training school instructors and their students. These forces often had Germany's best remaining equipment, King Tigers, Gag Tigers, the war's heaviest armored vehicles. And they discovered that even these metal mountains were vulnerable to tungsten cores. The engagement reports from April 1945 make for sobering reading. King Tigers with armor twice as thick as the original Tiger, destroyed by Shermans at 1,200 meters. Jag Tigers, essentially mobile bunkers with 128mm guns, knocked out before they could bring their massive weapons to bear. The tungsten rounds didn't care about German engineering prowess or armor thickness. Physics was physics, and kinetic energy concentrated into a tungsten core could defeat almost anything. But perhaps the most telling statistic comes from surrender reports. In the war's final month, numerous German tank crews surrendered without fighting when confronted by American armor, not because they were cowards, but because they knew resistance was futile. Their tanks, once symbols of German military might, had become death traps. The tungsten rounds had broken not just armor, but spirit. The story of HVAP doesn't end with Germany's surrender in May 1945. The lessons learned, the tactics developed, the psychological impact observed. All of it influenced military thinking for generations. When American tanks faced Soviet-built armor in Korea, in Vietnam, in Desert Storm, the ghost of those tungsten rounds was present. The principle that technology could overcome adversary advantages, that innovation could level playing fields, that industrial capacity could be converted into battlefield supremacy. Modern tank crews firing sabot rounds made from depleted uranium are spiritual descendants of Sergeant Jez and his 8 tungsten shells. The technology has evolved, but the concept remains unchanged. Concentrate energy into the densest possible penetrator. Deliver it at the highest possible velocity. Turn the enemy's strength, their armor, into a liability. The veterans who lived through the Tungsten Revolution often struggled to convey its importance to those who came after. How do you explain what it meant to suddenly have the power to fight back, to go from being hunted to being the hunter, to watch the enemy's best weapons burn from your guns? They would talk about the weight of those tungsten rounds in their hands, heavier than regular shells despite being smaller. That density, that concentration of power, somehow communicated itself through touch. Some crews kept spent, tungsten penetrators as souvenirs. These small, incredibly dense cores, recovered from destroyed German tanks, became talismans, proof that American innovation and industry could overcome any enemy advantage. Proof that David could indeed slay Goliath if David had tungsten stones for his sling. The German tank veterans, in their memoirs and interviews, consistently identified HVAP as a turning point. Not the turning point. The war had many, but a significant moment when psychological superiority shifted. Otto Carius, one of Germany's most successful tank aces, wrote, "The Americans learned to kill our tanks at ranges we thought impossible. Once that happened, the mythology of German armor superiority died. And with it died our confidence. The last Tigers to face American tungsten fell in late April 1945, just days before the war's end. These weren't the proud formations of earlier years, but scattered remnants, fuel-starved, ammunition depleted, crewed by boys and old men. They faced American armored divisions equipped with full loads of HVAP, confident in their ability to destroy any target. The engagement reports are almost clinical in their brevity. Tiger destroyed, range 1,200 meters, 1 round HVAP. The monster that had terrorized Allied tankers for 3 years had become just another target. As we reflect on that morning near Remagen, when Sergeant Jez proved American tanks could destroy Tigers at nearly 2,000 yards, we see more than just a tactical victory. We see adaptation overcoming superiority, innovation defeating tradition, industrial democracy crushing totalitarian militarism. Those 8 tungsten rounds in a single Sherman represented millions of rounds produced by free workers in free factories. They represented the genius of engineers who refused to accept impossible. They represented the courage of tankers who trusted in American ingenuity. The Tungsten Revolution of 1945 taught military planners a lesson that resonates today. Technical superiority is temporary. Today's invincible weapon is tomorrow's obsolete relic. What matters is the ability to adapt, to innovate, to turn industrial capacity into battlefield advantage. The Tiger was the superior tank, but the Sherman with tungsten rounds was the war-winning weapon. When veterans of the Rhineland campaign gathered for reunions in later years, they would sometimes bring those saved tungsten penetrators. Small, heavy, innocent-looking pieces of metal that had changed the course of armoured warfare. They would hold them, remember fallen comrades, remember the fear and the triumph, remember the moment when American tanks stopped running from Tigers and started hunting them. The final statistics are staggering. Between January and May 1945, American forces fired approximately 62,000 HVAP rounds in the European theatre. They destroyed or disabled an estimated 400 German heavy tanks, along with countless medium tanks and assault guns. The kill ratio when using tungsten ammunition was nearly 4-to-1 in America's favor. The ammunition that had been scarcer than gold in 1944 had become the sledgehammer that crushed the last remnants of German armour. But beyond the numbers, beyond the tactics and technology, the story of HVAP is fundamentally human. It's about young men in steel boxes, facing other young men in steel boxes, with death decided by fractions of inches and fragments of seconds. It's about the relief of having a weapon that could protect you, the confidence that came from carrying tungsten rounds, the hope that technology could overcome the terrible arithmetic of armoured combat. The last word belongs to Staff Sergeant Raymond Jez, who destroyed 3 Tigers that morning near Remagen. Asked years later what HVAP meant to American tankers, he thought for a long moment before answering, "It meant we could stop being afraid." For 2 years, we'd been told German tanks were better, and they were. Their armour was thicker, their guns bigger, but with tungsten, none of that mattered. We could reach out and touch them at ranges they never expected. We could penetrate armour they thought was invulnerable. We could win. That's what those 8 rounds in my tank meant. Not just that we could fight back, but that we could win. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.